Well, I think we have a quorum, so good afternoon, and thanks for coming. My name is Walt Kaminsky, and I'm chairperson of the Peacemaking and Social Justice Committee here at Wallingford Press. In a few moments, I'll welcome Zeke Hernandez. He's the reason you really came to hear, not me, but as is our practice, we give a little background on the biblical thoughts related to the subject that we're going to hear, and also about the PCUSA position on the specific subject. So, if you think about things in the Bible that relate to immigration, you can go all the way back to 2 Kings, and chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. Now Elijah had said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, "Get up and go with your household and settle wherever you can. For the Lord has called for a famine, and it will come on the land for 7 years." So the woman got up and did according to the word of the man of God. She went with her household and settled in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. I wonder if she had a green card. The Israelites went to Egypt because there was a famine in their country. The Israelites also, were forced to move out of their land by the Babylonians, and they were often forced to live under the control of many other attackers, which ended up with a lot of them resettling to other parts of the Middle East. And here's the ultimate one for all of you, so maybe we'll have a quiz later. Even Jesus and his family went to Egypt to escape persecution by Herod. What would the world be like today if he were sent back to Herod? Now, what does our denomination say about immigration? Well, the Presbyterian Church USA actively advocates for and works toward more just immigration laws and processes because we are guided by our faith's call to welcome the stranger and belief in the inherent dignity of all people. The work and ministry of PCUSA offices, advocates, and partners enable the church to provide direct support to those navigating the harrowing complexities of the immigration system, advocate for compassionate and just immigration laws and policies, and 3, collaborate with partners who directly respond to these critical and complex issues in a range of communities and settings. Through these ongoing efforts, the PCUSA seeks to embody Christ's call to justice, compassion, and welcome for all who journey in search of safety and hope. The 219th General Assembly produced the following resolution regarding a call to stand with immigrant Presbyterians in their hour of need. It begins with some history, so bear with me. The 206th General Assembly in 1994 adopted the call to Presbyterians to recommit to work and pray for a just and compassionate U.S. immigration policy. Again, in 1999 and 2004, Presbyterians, through General Assembly actions, guided by theological and ethical principles, continued to call for a commitment from both Presbyterians and the government to work toward welcoming immigrants into communities and providing just laws that affect those who live and work in the United States. In 2010, Presbyterians addressed the most appropriate way to respond to state laws that result in members of the population being targeted for increased scrutiny. They were to refrain from holding national meetings at hotels or non-PCUSA conference centers in those states where travel by immigrant Presbyterians or Presbyterians of color or Hispanic ancestry might subject them to harassment due to legislation similar to Arizona law SB 1070, which led to racial profiling. If individual congregations and camp and conference facilities deem it necessary, the PCUSA and its staff will offer non-financial support for the creation of accompaniment programs. If such laws are passed in states where PCUSA camp and conference centers are located, the 219th General Assembly encourages those centers, this is the key here, to develop sanctuary responses that would create safe places for all participants. And last, direct the Office of Immigration to develop resources that educate Presbyterians about the history of immigrant policies, the beneficial aspects of immigration in the United States, as well as official anti-immigration conduct, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The world's awash in those who have been displaced from their homes and would probably like to go somewhere safe. I believe the number at the end of 2024 was 122.6 million people displaced from their home. Let's pray for them. God, help us be like Christ in the world, your pillar of fire urging for the just and humane treatment of your people on the move in today's world. Please give leaders of countries where violence, war, and oppression forced people to abandon their homes, carrying all their life's work in a small bundle, the compassion and mercy needed to work for a lasting peace in their country. Help those of us with resources to unclench our fists and reach out a hand to embrace and welcome those traumatized by war or violence or oppression. In the name of Christ, the Prince of Peace, Emmanuel, God with us, we pray. Amen. Okay, now let me introduce Zeke, which is the reason why you're all here. Okay, Zeke Hernandez is the Max and Bernice Garchik Family Presidential Associate Professor at Wharton. He publishes pioneering research in two broad areas. In the first, he explores how immigration affects the investment choices, growth, and performance of firms. In the second, he studies how firms design corporate strategies through alliances, acquisitions, and divestitures to enhance their innovation and performance. Zeke's papers have been published in leading academic journals such as Management Science, Administrative Science Quarterly, Organization Science, Strategic Management Journal, and the Academy of Management Journal. Renowned expert on the topic of immigration, Zeke is the author of The Truth About Immigration: Why Successful Societies Welcome Newcomers. Providing clarity on one of the most important but misunderstood topics of our time, the book has received glowing coverage in outlets such as The Economist, Freakonomics, CBS, MSNBC, NPR, Kirkus Reviews, Forbes, Barron's, Bloomberg, and more. Zeke has won emerging scholar awards from the three major academic associations in his field: the Strategic Management Society, Strategic Management Division of the Academy of Management, and the International Management Division of the Academy of Management. In addition to these career recognitions, he's received multiple awards for individual research papers. Zeke is a sought-after speaker and one of the highest-rated teachers at Wharton. He consistently wins Teaching Excellence Awards and has been recognized by poets and quants as a best 40, under 40 professor in the world. He trains MBA students and corporate executives on issues related to global strategy, corporate strategy, and global talent management. He also speaks to audiences from all walks of life on immigration, demographic change, and economic growth. At the end of his talk, Zeke will be signing books in the reception room. Through these doors to my left, we'll have light snacks. If you want to buy a book, the cost is $18, and Zeke would be glad to autograph it for you. He has also volunteered that if you don't get your questions answered here during the Q&A session, he will be willing to answer them in the reception room. So join us afterwards and have a chat, have a snack, and get a little education. With that, finally, I'm going to turn it over to Zeke. Zeke?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. Walt, everybody can hear me, right? Yeah, seems very clear. Walt, thank you for that introduction. And thank you for speaking about the PCA's position on this issue. Very helpful for me, too. Is the sound okay, or is it a little too loud? It's perfectly fine? Okay, very good. So I come to you really, I'm going to speak to you as the academic and professor that Walt introduced. But I think in this setting, it's important for me to say that I'm also a fellow Christian. I see myself as a follower of Christ, like I think many of you who are here probably do. I believe in his injunction to love one another. I also believe in his injunction from Matthew 25, where he says, he uses this story and the wording that I was a stranger and you took me in. So I very much believe in that, and that is part of what I live my life by. But I am not going to give primarily a religious perspective today in my presentation, but I'm happy to talk about that during the question and answer session or whenever you feel it's relevant. Okay? Let me also say, before I jump in, that I'm really grateful that you're here. I don't take it for granted that you're spending probably all in a couple of hours of your time to listen to me, and so I really appreciate that. Immigration, of course, is, it's an understatement to say that it's a controversial topic, right? And it's not just that it's in the news once a week. It's in the news multiple times a day, multiple times an hour now, right? And every headline is controversial. So the first thing I want to say as we start is just relax, okay? Because there's actually research showing that when people say the word immigration, people tense up, right? And so some of you are probably here feeling some anxiety. You're like, well, is he gonna say this thing that's gonna upset me, or is he gonna talk about this or that? So let me just say, relax. Okay? If you have a copy of the book, which you can see there, it's not a coincidence that it's a colorful cover, right? With birds and yellow and blue. And we made that decision very deliberately with the publisher because when you know the evidence about immigration and what it does, it's actually, there's way more, overwhelmingly more to celebrate and be happy about, and way more agreement than there is disagreement, okay? So let me just start by saying, relax. All right. Now, I've been studying this topic academically for nearly 20 years. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you 3 stories. I plan to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes. I'm going to share 3 stories that illustrate 3 important principles that we know from research, and then I just want to have a conversation with you, so feel free to ask any question you want, including the controversial and tough questions. Because if we can't have a conversation here about the tough questions, then we're doomed. Okay? All right. So the first story I want to tell you begins with something that I experienced personally. So I am an immigrant myself. I come from the little country of Uruguay. I don't know if anybody has been to Uruguay. Okay, on purpose or by accident?
I'm Uruguayan.
Oh, really? What's your name?
My name is Rosana.
Rosana. Very nice to meet you. Mucho gusto. That's very good. We are the only 2 Uruguayans you're likely to meet in your whole life. Uruguay is a tiny country? Oh, you are too. So 3 of them. Okay. So there's about 3.5 million Uruguayans total, right? And so the odds that you'll meet more than one are very low. Okay. So I came from Uruguay nearly 25 years ago to come to college here in the United States. At that point in my life, I had 0 interest in immigration as an academic topic. I didn't think of myself as an immigrant. I was just an international student here for a few years to get a degree. And I remember that, one of the things that I found very strange about life in the United States, especially being a young man, was the whole concept of dating in America, right? It was just very weird to me, okay? And I got my first date this way, okay? A young woman, a girl who was a friend of a friend, approached me, and she said, "Hey, Zeke, you're from Latin America, right?" And I said, "Yep." And she's like, "Oh, great. When are you going to take me salsa dancing?" And now, I was a little taken aback, right? But I didn't let it show, okay? And what you have to understand is that I thought this girl was very cute, very attractive. I liked her. I'd known her for a few weeks. And so Now, what I'm about to tell you all happened in my head in a split second, okay? But I'm slowing the story down, okay? And so in my head, of course, looking at this girl who I thought was very attractive, and I'm thinking, well, I definitely want to go on a date with you for sure. I said, but she's thinking, well, all South Americans can dance salsa. Zeke is South American. Conclusion, Zeke can dance salsa, right? I mean, it's a perfectly logical argument, except it's totally wrong, okay? And there's a few things she doesn't understand. One of them is that Uruguay is very, very far down in South America, right? Very far from the epicenter of salsa. But more importantly, young men from my part of the world who get scholarships to come to the United States are not the kinds who spent their formative nights and weekends going to salsa clubs, okay? We're complete nerds. So my hips don't move sideways. My hips move up and down. They move down to do homework, up to go to class. Down to do homework, up to go to class, okay? So anyway, I'm thinking, well, if I tell her all this, there's going to be no date, but I really want to go out with her. So I smile and I say, absolutely, I'll take you salsa dancing. And she says, great, pick me up this Friday at 8 o'clock. And I'm really happy for about a second, and then she walks away, and I'm like, what have I just done? Because I have to go salsa dancing now. I don't even know where there's a salsa club, so my non-Latino friends had to tell me where to find a salsa club, and then I had to call my sister to try to teach me to dance salsa, and there just wasn't enough time. And so we show up Friday night at 8, and I pick her up, and we go into the salsa club, and the lights are even dimmer than they are, here. And the first thing I see when we get in is this couple, and they're just dancing beautifully, and they're just kind of spinning through the dance floor, and my heart sinks because I can't do that, right? And so I say, well, what the heck? So I grab my date's hips, and we start dancing, and her heart sinks because I can't do that. And now, if this were a Hollywood story, you would think, well, this ended up great. She ended up being my wife, right? But this is not a Hollywood story. So my wife is right there. That's not who I'm talking about, okay? This was the worst date you could possibly, it's as bad as you could possibly imagine. It was just horrible, right? She had a horrible time. I had an awful time. There was no second date. And I've lost track of her. And she probably is very glad that I've lost track of her. So you're probably thinking, well, what does any of this have to do with immigration? Well, it turns out that it has a lot to do with it for this reason. So let me tell you the story of salsa the music, okay? This woman assumed that salsa was created in Latin America. So did I, which is why I felt so kind of bad that I couldn't dance salsa, even though I was Latin American. But actually, salsa was not created in Latin America, okay? Does anybody in this room know where salsa was invented? Anybody happen to know?
Spain.
So Spain is a very good guess. It's not Spain, but it's not a bad guess, actually.
Cuba?
So Cuba is probably the best guess, and that's probably where salsa should have been invented, but it's not. It's not. Miami? Yeah, Miami's a good guess, right? Because you would think, so no, a little bit north of Miami. New York, Queens. Queens, New York. Yeah, Queens, of all places. And this is how it happened. It's the late 50s, early 60s. A group of Latin American immigrants from, who said Cuba? From Cuba, the Dominican Republic, other countries in Latin America. They're in Brooklyn, and as musicians do, they go and they want to play and they want to jam, right? But they're not just jamming with each other, they're jamming with musicians from New York and locals. In fact, one of the people most involved in this movement was a Jewish guy named Larry Harlow, who played keyboards. So if you hear keyboards in Latin American music now, that is a Jewish American contribution, is not a... So out of these jam sessions, by the early 60s arises a very distinctive style of music that didn't have a name yet, okay? And it's catchy, as you know. And the issue is that none of the major recording labels are recording salsa, okay? So as often happens, an immigrant took matters in his own hands. So Johnny Pacheco, immigrant from the Dominican Republic, partners up with an Italian-American lawyer in Queens, and they start a label called Fania Records, okay? And Fania records the very first salsa album in 1964. And it goes viral, as they say, okay? And so people start going to salsa clubs, so there's new clubs that are popping up to play this music. Fania starts signing legendary artists that any salsa fan would recognize. And they become the Fania All-Stars, and they start touring. They fill Yankee Stadium 5 times, okay? They go all over the US, all over the world. And out comes this thing called salsa, okay? That to my dismay, decades later, I have to take a day to, okay? All right, now, you might think, well, why does this story matter? Why does it matter? Because in many ways, this story, this very simple story, embodies just about everything you need to know about what immigration does for the economy, okay? If you think like an economist, this is a very telling story, okay? Because out of the remix of immigrant and local talent, ideas, preferences, okay, comes an innovation that is a cultural innovation, but it's also a business innovation, okay, that creates real investment, okay, real investment that creates a company and jobs, because think of all the dance clubs and the concert halls and the stadiums that get filled, okay, those jobs and businesses create tax revenue, right, both locally and nationally, okay, and we have this innovation that makes the lives not just of the immigrants better, but of people better in this case, right? Either by creating jobs for them or making their lives more interesting. So the only person whose life is worse off because of this is probably mine as a freshman in college, okay? All right, now, you might think, well, I don't care about salsa, right? Or I don't care about music. Well, let me tell you the salsa story in different form, okay? In a form that perhaps is more obviously connected to things that make our lives better off. So, is anyone here a scientist by chance? Does anyone here have a patent? You have a patent in what? In what area, sir? What?
Coding.
Okay, very good, very good. Anyone else? Walt? Okay, excellent. Very important patent, right? For many people on Friday night at 8 at the Salsa Club, I guess. Okay, well, a study came out recently showing that, that immigrants in the United States, as you can see here, they contribute, so they are responsible for 36% of all patents in the US, right? That's over a third, okay? This number is even more impressive when you realize that immigrants are only 16% of inventors, okay? So they're punching more than double their weight in terms of their contribution to patented innovation in America. But what's, to me, even more interesting than that is that you can break down this into 2 quantities. So you see the 23 and the 13%, right? So 23% is the percentage of patents in which immigrants are direct inventors of record, right? Like Walt, or I don't know your name, sir.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, right. They're the direct inventors on record. But the other 13% to me is perhaps even more interesting, because that 13% are patents that are filed by native-born, US-born inventors that they would not have created had they not interacted with immigrants. Why? Because they were exposed to a new idea, to a new way of solving a problem, to a new network of scientists or engineers in foreign countries that the immigrants are from that they wouldn't have been able to connect to, okay? And this is a big deal, because whether it's linings for beer beverages, right? Or whether it's a life-saving medicine, right? Whether it's a technology like the mRNA technology in the COVID vaccine that has saved billions of lives, okay? Or something as simple as a technology that allows you to communicate instantly, right? With your children, or tweet an anti-immigrant post, okay? These technologies make our lives better, more comfortable, etc., right? But what I want to point out is that whether it's salsa or a patent, it's the same story, right? It's the interaction of native-born and foreign-born people that create innovations, that create jobs, that create businesses, that create a lot of investment capital opportunities, etc., etc., etc. Okay? And I'll formalize this in just a few minutes. I'm wondering, sorry, if I could get a glass of water or just, Okay, my throat is starting to dry up a little bit. Actually, my wife is, okay, very good.
What a wife.
There we go. Walt, I got it.
No.
Okay,
Our first date was playing tennis, so
Yeah.
more up my alley.
all right, very good. So that's story number one. Let me tell you story number two, much shorter than the salsa story. So about 2 years ago, I was, I read the business news or follow the business news pretty closely. And this article in the Associated Press caught my eye. And the headline is cut off here. But what it says is chip component plant to get $300 million expansion in Pennsylvania. Okay? And now, this is the kind of thing that everyone wants in their community, right? You talk to the average person, what do they want? They want investment in their community. You talk to the mayor, the Chamber of Commerce, the governor, they want investment, right? Why? Because investment creates jobs, investment creates tax revenue, investment is sort of the beginning of every economic benefit you could possibly get. What caught my eye is that this particular chip component plant is located in hometown Pennsylvania, okay? Has anyone been to hometown PA? Okay, population 3,500, far from anything, right? At least over an hour and a half from Philly, 2 or 3 hours from New York, et cetera. So it's just a weird place for a high-end chip component manufacturer to get a $300 million investment, which, by the way, created 200 skilled manufacturing jobs, right? These are well-paying manufacturing jobs. And what this chip plant makes, it makes components that companies like Intel or NVIDIA use, right? So the point is, this is a very important kind of factory here, right? So these things always catch my attention, especially when they happen in unusual places like hometown PA. So I did a little digging, and I discovered two things that tend to go together a lot, okay? The first thing I discovered is that EMD Electronics, which is the name of this chip component plant, is owned by a German corporation, okay? They're the subsidiary of a German company, okay? So this is not local capital, this is foreign capital. And the second is that hometown Pennsylvania was founded in the early 1800s by German immigrants, okay? In fact, for a few decades, they only spoke German there and has a very strong German heritage to this day. And those two things are not a coincidence, okay? So in the 20 years that I've researched immigration, this is one of my main areas of studies. One of the things that my colleagues and I have found is that where immigrants settle, investment follows. Investment from their home countries, okay? And that's true of ancestral immigration, like Germans in hometown, or recent immigration. For example, here in Pennsylvania, some of our biggest sources of investment, foreign investment, are China, India, and Mexico, okay? Right? Guess where immigrants have come from in the last 30 years to Pennsylvania? China, India, and Mexico, okay? The point is that if you pay attention to where business investment is coming from, especially internationally, it has a lot to do with where immigrants from that country have settled before. Right? Because business creates networks of information and trust that make investment possible, okay? And it's not just this, it's not just foreign investment. So here is a figure that I'll explain in just a second. It's also that immigrants directly, so not from abroad, but directly, are more likely to invest in their own businesses. We know from census data that immigrants are 80% more likely to start a business. Right? That's nearly twice as likely, okay? So the rate of business creation by immigrants is very high, okay? And those businesses create jobs. So let me explain this figure. What this figure shows here on the vertical axis is the rate of business founding by immigrants, solid line, and native-born or US-born people, dotted line, okay? And what you see on the horizontal axis is the number of jobs that business has created 5 years after it was started, okay? And so as you see in any neighborhood, there's a lot of small employers, right? 0 to 10 jobs. And then there's a few very large employers, right, that create over 1,000 jobs. But what's important to understand is that regardless of the size of the business, immigrant-started businesses, right, the rate is always higher for immigrants than for natives. okay? In plain English, that means that whether you're talking about an ethnic restaurant in the corner, okay, or a corner store selling remittances and calling cards, or Zoom, Google, Pfizer, Colgate, Budweiser, right, for our beer can liner patenter here, or just about any business that you use every day, right? If you use Zoom, has anyone used Zoom in the last week? Immigrant business, okay? So whatever business you're interacting with, immigrant-founded businesses create more jobs than native-founded businesses, okay? So again, you start to see that whether it's salsa or patents or businesses that create jobs and create new products and technologies that you use every day, there's something about immigration that is good for all of us, right? Not just good for immigrants, is kind of the point, okay? All right, third story. So I'm going to skip this. If there's one stylized fact that you need to know about immigration in the United States, it's this figure here. This is what I call the roller coaster figure, okay? And what this figure shows is the share of the US population that is foreign-born over time, okay? Now, we start at 1850 because that's when we start to have good census records. You see that in 1850, that share was about 10%. And I call it the roller coaster, right? The roller coaster starts to climb to about 15%. And I don't know if you've ever been on a roller coaster. They make me throw up, okay? But you know how when the roller coaster's starting to crest and you get that feeling in your stomach, like, oh, this is not going to be good? Well, America started to feel that way when we reached 15% because they said, oh, no, the immigrants at this point were Irish, German, Northern and Western European. But these immigrants here, they're Italians, Poles, Jews, Catholics. They're inferior. They're going to threaten America, right? They're not coming in the right way. Sound familiar? And so what did we do in 1924? We closed the border. We passed the 1924 National Origins Act on May 26, 1924, under the idea that we had to protect America from these inferior Southern and Eastern Europeans, and let alone Asians. And so we set quotas of 0 for Asians, no Asians allowed. Okay? Actually, you could bring 100 people from an Asian country, but they had to be Caucasian. Okay? So they could be born in Asia, but they had to be Caucasian, right? Not racist at all. Okay? And then the quotas for Southern and Eastern Europeans essentially were 0, right? They dropped by over 90%. And so what happened to immigration? The roller coaster came roaring down, right? We reached our lowest point in history in 1970, below 5%. And then at that point, the US immigration system became an embarrassment in the eyes of the world. And so we passed a law in 1965 to undo the national origins quotas, the quotas by country of origin, and we created the system essentially that we have now. And we've entered our second wave of mass migration where the roller coaster has started to go up, and as it's approaching 15%, America's getting that feeling of their pit in their stomach, okay? And the question is, where do we go next, right? Do we do another 1924, or do we do something else, right? And that's the question, of course, the question that many people are voting on and that politicians are campaigning on very aggressively. So this third story I want to tell you is a story to just help you think of what is at stake, okay? What is at stake? What might happen if we repeat 1924? Now, this is going to seem like a strange story. How many of you like the sport of soccer or football, okay? All right, so that's a healthy number of hands. I told you I'm from Uruguay. We are obsessed with soccer in Uruguay. If you don't play soccer as a kid, you get beat up, okay? So unlike salsa, right, if that girl had said, hey, do you want to go play soccer with me? I would have been like, absolutely, okay? And I would have looked good. So one of the things that we love the World Cup. That's because Uruguay won the first World Cup in history, okay, in 1930. We were the first World Cup champions, and so we're very proud of this, okay? So the World Cup is a big deal. When I was a little boy, Well, not really little, but a young boy, in 1990. I was very excited because the World Cup was going to, happen, and I was going to spend it was winter back, down there, but summer here, watching the World Cup. Okay, and the big headline leading up to that World Cup is that the United States is going to play in the World Cup, right? Because this was unusual, right? And so everyone was talking about the United States. Now, with apologies to those of you who are from the United States, which is most of you, the U.S. was a laughing stock for us. We made fun of the U.S. men's national team because to us they were just terrible, right? They were just really bad, okay? And even in America, there is this story about U.S. men's soccer that they were bad, and then out of nowhere they show up in the 1990 World Cup, okay? And then ever since then, they've sort of been to the World Cup, and they've been decent. They've been respectable, okay? All right. But what if I told you, actually, that narrative is wrong? The U.S. wasn't always bad and then showed up out of nowhere. The U.S. appearing in the 1990 World Cup was a comeback story, okay? A comeback story. Here's the comeback story. So this is too small for you to see, okay? But this is actually a little table from Wikipedia. And what this table shows here is that the U.S. actually played in the very first World Cup, and not only did they play, they finished in third place, bronze medal, okay? And it wasn't a fluke. The U.S. was good. They made it through the group stage very comfortably. They made it to the semifinal against Argentina, which was one of the two favorites, along with Uruguay, okay? And they actually were competitive against Argentina, but back then you couldn't sub players, even if they were injured. And so one of the U.S. forwards got injured, and so the U.S. played a man down for half the game and lost. Okay? So the point is the U.S. was good. Okay? The U.S. was very good. The U.S. played in the second World Cup in 1934. They did not do so well in that one, but they still made it. Then they boycotted the 1938 World Cup because of the Nazi invasion of Austria. Okay? And then the World Cup was canceled for the next two editions because of World War II. 1950, the World Cup comes back, and to no one's surprise, the U.S. is back in the World Cup in 1950. Okay? So you see that the U.S. actually had a good men's soccer team. Okay? In fact, in 1950, right here, this is that line right there, the U.S. pulled off one of the biggest upsets in the history of the World Cup. They beat England, 1-0. Okay? Now, England had never lost an international game by 1950. International meaning a country-to-country game, right? England against another country. They had never lost. So it was a bit like playing England in the World Cup was like playing the U.S. basketball team in the Olympics, right? You kind of expect the U.S. to win. But the U.S. men sort of pull off a miracle. They win 1-0. The goalkeeper is carried off, on the people's shoulder. This is a big deal, right? This is a big deal that they beat England. And then that was the high watermark of U.S. men's soccer for the next 40 years. After that, the U.S. really did stink. They were bad, okay? There's no two ways about it. For 40 years, they tried to make it to the World Cup, and they just can't because they just don't have talent. They're not good enough. Until 1990, when they come back. And now most of us are familiar with what's happened since 1990, at least if you follow the sport. So what does this have to do with immigration? Well, it has a lot to do with it. Here's why. What you see here in this table is the roster of the team that beat England in 1950, the 1950 U.S. men's team that went to the Olympics. Okay? Now again, that's small for those of you in the back, but what I want you to mostly focus on is the birthplace of the players or their parents. Okay? 82% of the squad were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. Okay? And if you pay attention to the countries they're from, it's also very telling, right? So you see, for example, for the parents, you see Portugal, all from Fall River, Massachusetts, right? A big cluster of Portuguese migrants there. You see Italy, right? A lot of Italians from St. Louis, Missouri, right? I lived in St. Louis for 2 years. Strong Italian heritage from the early 1900s, okay? You see players from Belgium, Croatia, okay? the odd a Haitian. Actually, this Haitian is the one who scored the goal against England. You see a Pole, okay? Why those countries? Because those are the countries where immigrants came from in the 20 to 30 years before the 1950 World Cup. Okay? And if you do the same exercise for the 1930 team, the 1938 team, or the current team, basically what you see is a pattern like this. The source of talent for the US men's national team is a delayed reaction to where immigrants came from 20 to 30 years earlier. Okay? So the team that did very well in the 30s, right, was composed of immigrants from the early 1900s, late 1800s. The team that was terrible for 40 years is a delayed reaction because there was no talent, right? No soccer talent coming from abroad, and so the US was really bad. And the team that since 1990 has been good is a delayed reaction to the uptick in immigration since 1970, okay? So this is, again, just like you might not care about salsa, you might not care about soccer, but the story is very important because it tells us a much more general point, okay? The ability of the United States and many, many countries, okay, to be on the leading edge of talent, right? National security, things that we really care about, depends significantly on our openness to immigration, okay? Right now, for example, everyone's talking about AI, right? Artificial intelligence. Okay? In the United States, 53% of people with PhDs in AI were born abroad. Okay? Without immigration, my students would not be using ChatGPT to cheat in my class. Okay? But you understand the point I'm making, right? Our science and engineering workforce, okay, is about more than a third foreign-born, but if you look at people with masters and PhDs, is nearly half, okay? If you look at our construction workforce, so it's not just highbrow, high-tech stuff. Our construction workforce is about a third foreign-born, but more than half in bottleneck areas like floor installation and drywalling and roofing, okay? So construction firms can't bid on jobs if they don't have enough workers, right? Which they don't if we restrict immigration. The same is true for farming. The same is true for lots and lots and lots of areas. Does that make sense? So that's what's at stake, okay? Now, let me see how I'm doing with time. Okay, so let me start winding down here. First of all, let me just kind of tell you the general point from these three stories, okay? So when we talk about immigration in this country and in every country, unfortunately, we have fallen prey to two stories, okay? Two narratives, and most people believe one or the other, okay? The most common narrative right now is the narrative that won the election recently here in the United States. Okay, it's the idea that immigrants are villains. They're here to take your job, they're here to commit crime, and they're here to destroy the cultural heritage that you love. Okay? And that's not just in the US. In every major country, there is a political party for which this is a big part of their platform. Okay? What's interesting to me is not that there's an anti-immigrant platform, that you expect that. What's interesting to me is what the alternative is, okay? And it is, yes, a pro-immigrant platform, but it's pro-immigrant in a very peculiar way. And this is what I call the immigrants as victims story, the victim story, okay? So with all due respect to Emma Lazarus's poem, Bring Me Your Tired, Your Poor Huddled Masses, right? We all learn it when we're kids here in the US. The way we have interpreted it has done a great disservice because it paints immigrants as needy outsiders, right? We owe them compassion. It might cost us a lot to welcome them, but hey, it's the right thing to do. Religious people like me are particularly prone to that, right? Why? Because we believe in the New Testament mandate, right? To offer love and compassion. Okay, and it's true, there are many immigrants who initially need love and compassion and maybe some resources. But the problem is that this is a story about immigration being good for immigrants, right? And so you have the villain story, immigration is bad for natives, and you have the pity story, immigration is good for immigrants, but it might cost us. And the problem is that both can be true simultaneously. And in politics, pity does not win, right? Fear wins every time over pity. But the 3 stories I've showed you, they're not about immigrants needing your fear or your pity, right? The stories that I've told you, and most importantly, what the empirical evidence tells us, is that immigrants are good for us. Okay? Good for us. That is, and they're good for us in many ways. Let me summarize it in terms of the economy, okay? So, when it comes to the economy, when you put together these 2 stories, immigrants as villains and immigrants as victims, you get this lay economic model that we call Schrodinger's immigrant, right? The idea that somehow immigrants are simultaneously taking all the jobs and consuming all the welfare, right? They are doing both, okay? They're that good, okay? And this is based on 2 faulty assumptions that come from the villain and victim dichotomy. The first one is that when an immigrant arrives to your local neighborhood or your state or your country, their main contribution to the economy is their labor. They fill a job. They are a body that fills a job. And the second assumption is that it doesn't matter where a worker is from, they are the same. A worker is a worker is a worker, okay? So then you get into a zero-sum competition between foreign bodies and US-born bodies, okay? Of course, that's not true. The stories that I told you, which are backed by the evidence, very clearly show us that this is not true. So let me give you a better mental model to think about this. When a person interacts with the economy, and don't think of an immigrant, just think of yourself, right? Now, you do fill a job, right? Or at least if you're not retired, you do, okay? But you do more than that, right? What else do you do in the economy? Huh? You buy stuff, right? You don't sit on your hands after work, right? You have to eat, and so you consume. What else do you do? Do you get all your paycheck, by the way? You pay taxes, right? Okay. Now, if you're doing it right, you also don't spend all your money, right? What else should you do with part of your money? You need to save, so you're an investor, whether you think about yourself that way or not. You're an investor. If you invest for retirement, you might start a business and invest in a business. You might invest beyond retirement savings, but you are an investor, okay? And you might have a good idea, right? Some of you at least, right? That idea might turn into a technology or a product or something, okay? So the point is that every person brings 5 inputs to the economy: talent, consumption, taxes, investment, and innovation, okay? You can't flatten people's contributions as just bringing their labor. That makes no sense. It makes no sense for you, and it doesn't make sense for an immigrant. So when immigrants arrive, at least in reasonable numbers, what you get is, of course, job creation, because jobs come from these 5 inputs, okay? And so you get a higher quantity of these things, okay? The way economists put it, the way we do it, is we say that the economic pie has gotten bigger, okay, because of these 5 inputs, okay? But wait, there's more, okay? Right now, these 2 people that I've drawn are the same color, but in reality, an immigrant is just a little bit different than a native-born person, right? And we saw it in the stories that I shared with you, right? They like different things, right? Different food, different music, right? They have fun in slightly different ways. They're not totally different, but they're a little bit different, right? They have different talent. They bring different skills, different ways of thinking, different kinds of education, okay? And so they have ideas and innovate in different ways, okay? They invest in different kinds of businesses, and they have connections to different investment networks, okay? Like the German heritage people in hometown Pennsylvania. And so what you see is that not only do you get an economy that is bigger, the pie is bigger, yes, but the pie is more diversified as well. So you get a quantity and a variety effect. Now, this is the holy grail of every economy. You want an economy that's big and diversified. The worst thing you could have is a tiny economy that depends on one input, okay? Right? And you know, we've seen this, right? The small Rust Belt town that depends on one thing, right? That's the worst thing you could have. So the reason immigration is good for us, economically speaking, is that, right? Is that you get a bigger and more diversified economy, okay? So that's what you need to know as far as immigration and the economy, okay? And I could add, numbers to all of this. I think I'm going to skip that just for the sake of time, but I can come back to this, all right? So let me finish with one thing, and then we'll get into the conversation. So far, I've told you everything that's right with immigration, okay? But of course, we have a lot of fights about this, right? So some of you might be saying, okay, but it can't all be so rosy or so perfect, okay? So let me spend just 5 minutes on that, and then I'm sure we'll spend more on it in the Q&A part. I think to understand what's right and what's wrong with immigration, you have to distinguish between immigrants and the immigration system. Notice that I have been talking about immigrants, right? Evidence tells us that pretty much most is right with immigrants because they do these things, right, that are good for us. They're good for them too, by the way, but they're good for us. Where we should have an honest conversation is about the system, right? What is a system by which we allow or don't allow people to do these things, okay? And you've heard many times that our immigration system is broken in the US, and it is, right? But it's broken in a way that's bad for us, okay? So why do we have so much illegal or irregular or undocumented immigration, okay? It's not because there's just a few bad actors taking advantage of the system. It's because we created a system that incentivizes irregular immigration. So let me just give you some examples of this. The last time, does anybody know the last time we updated the number and types of visas we give in this country? When was the last time? Does anybody happen to know? If you read the book, you know, but 1965 is a good guess. That was the second to last time. Huh? So Reagan did an amnesty in 1986, but he actually didn't change the number or types of visas. So actually, it was not a change in system. It was just amnesty for about 3 million undocumented immigrants. So it was actually under George H.W. Bush in 1990, okay? Now, think about how different the world is now than in 1990. That already tells you something. So this decrepit system that hasn't been updated since 1990 has some really cool features like the following, okay? Let's say that you are a farm owner, okay? Your kids don't work the farm anymore, so you need to hire year-round farm laborers, okay? How many visas do we have for year-round farm workers in the United States? How many visas does our system allow?
0.
Yeah, 0. Okay? You're a construction firm. You need a carpenter or a plumber. How many visas for carpenters and plumbers do we have? 0. Okay? You're an Indian with a master's degree in computer science. By all accounts, the kind that we want, right? Okay? You're waiting in line for a green card. How long is that line? How long does this Indian with a master's degree in computer science have to wait to get a green card?
8 years. 127 or so.
You said 127? It's 195. And by 2031, that will be 437 years. Okay? So we say things like, well, why don't these people just get in line? The problem is our system has no lines, literally no lines for many cases, or lines that are so unjustly long, right? So what we're doing, when we say we want to just enforce the system, we are enforcing a system that makes no sense and it makes it even worse, okay? So my point, to be clear, my point today is not, oh, well, let's just let people come in illegally. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you can enforce a bad system, but you'll get more irregular immigration, or understanding that immigrants do these things with the premise that they're good for us, reform the system so that we allow more visas and a greater variety of visas, and that will take care of the irregular immigration problem. So my critique of the current approach of the administration, it's not necessarily that they want order in the border, right? That's fine, I want order in the border. But the way they're going about it is self-defeating because they are enforcing a system that incentivizes illegal immigration, and the more you enforce it, the more you incentivize it. So what I want to hear is how are we going to change the system, right? And then we can get the real win-wins. All right, let me stop there. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and you've been very patient in listening. So let's talk. Yeah.
So if you were in charge,
If I were in charge, what would I do? So the question was, if I were in charge, what would I do? So first, I would ban all salsa clubs from America. No, I'm just kidding. So I would do 2 or 3 things. The first one that I would do, and this is going to seem like a strange thing, is, let me go back to the fear and pity thing, right? What agency is in charge of our immigration apparatus right now? It's Department of Homeland Security. What does that tell you? Isn't that telling? Right. We have put the agency that is supposed to protect us in charge of immigration, right? So what does that do? That tells us that we have, as national policy, we are administering immigration under the immigrants as villains narrative, okay? That's been true since 9/11, by the way. Okay, that's when it happened, after 9/11. Now, and this is not just a symbolic issue. This is very practical because when you have security officials, security-minded officials who are thinking every day, their job every day is, how do I protect you from these foreigners? Then the policies and the rules tend to be restrictive, right? They're not about creating value for you, they're about protecting you. So now imagine that we gave immigration to the Department of Commerce. Very different framing, but very different practical implications on a day-to-day basis, because now an official is tasked with saying, well, how can we use immigration to create jobs? How do we use immigration to attract investment? Do you see what I mean? Right? How do we make sure that we allocate the immigrants that arrive to states that need them most? Right? As opposed to just having chaos at the border. So it's more than just a symbolic change. The other thing I would do is, you can say whatever you want about it, but we need more immigrants, right? Given that our birth rates are so low, that our population is aging, right? But in 1990, we were at above replacement birth rates. We're well below now, right? So we need to double or triple the number of immigrants we allow legally, but we also need to, and the third thing, and this is the end of my answer, would be just we have to have a lot more variety of categories of visas for plumbers and year-round farm workers and carpenters, and we have to let that Indian not wait 195 years. Does that make sense? And so it's just quantity, variety, and a different agency administering the system. Those would be like the first 3 things that I would do, right? There's a lot more details, but those would be the first 3. Yes, sir?
Yeah, we've had an excellent system going before, i.e. refugee resettlement,
Yeah.
where individual candidates to come here are 100% vetted.
Yeah.
And are supported then by the government when they come in to get them started.
Yeah.
So that they can get settled, get a job, pay their taxes, and so forth. But as of the last several weeks, that's been curtailed.
Yeah. Yeah, so did everyone hear the comment? The comment was, we've had a good system to allow refugees that are vetted. That system has been curtailed, and that's true, right? The current administration has... So one thing about the system, too, is that so for work and family-related visas, those are only changed by an act of Congress. But humanitarian immigration, so refugees and asylees, are directly controlled by the executive branch. And the president can, in one snap of a finger, end the program, right? And so President Trump indeed has set the level of refugee and asylee admissions to 0, okay? And so when we don't have that, what you're doing is you're putting more pressure on the other system, right? And this is very important to understand, because when you talk about, say, Central American migrant, right, family that is coming through the border either because their daughter was raped by a gang, or they're a climate migrant, right, because climate has led their farm to dry up and they're starving, and they show up at the border. Are they an illegal immigrant? Are they a humanitarian migrant? Are they a climate migrant? They're all of the above. Does that make sense? So when we restrict the pathways through the legal vetting that you mentioned, we create pressure for the irregular kind, right? That's why, that's why it's about the system, right? We have to get the system right. Yes, what's your name?
I wonder, could you speak to any distinctions that are significant between immigration and, or immigrants and refugees?
Yeah. So any distinctions in terms of what I discussed already? Or just in general?
Anything they think is significant
Yeah.
for us to be.
Okay, so the question is are there any differences between refugees and immigrants? So let me now come back to this. So from an economic standpoint, there is no difference. That is whether, so by the way, just for clarity of terminology, immigrants is the general category. Anyone who was foreign born and now lives here is an immigrant. A refugee is one kind of immigrant, right? So the differences are in their pathways of arrival. A refugee comes here for humanitarian reasons, is admitted, given parole by the US government, and usually given assistance also, some early assistance. And asylee, very similar. And then we also distinguish between economic migrants who come here with a job, a work visa, and then family migrants who come here to reunite with a family member. But they're all immigrants, okay? Now, regardless of the category, they all do these 5 things. In fact, refugees and asylees get to do these 5 things faster than less educated immigrants, just because they get some resources from the government, right? So they're able to settle in just a little bit faster. Now, they all do this, all of them do, even undocumented immigrants do these things. It just takes them a bit longer if they're not vetted or welcomed. So from an economic standpoint, it's the same, but of course, the immigrant experience is better for a refugee or an asylee because they have that support. But that's really the only difference. I don't know if I answered the question implied in your, or not.
I wonder what difference it makes that some are voluntary
Yeah,
and intentional about, like, it was, like, they wanted and they had time to plan to come
yeah,
to another country.
yeah,
And make a home there.
yeah,
And might have had time to plan a future.
yeah,
And then some might not.
yeah.
Some are not voluntarily in the city.
Yeah, I understand what you're asking. And what's surprising, and we do have evidence on this, is actually that refugees, right, and asylees who are forced, they're forced migrants, they actually assimilate a little bit faster in terms of language acquisition, job market integration. I think it's partly because for them, psychologically, there's no turning back. Does that make sense? Whereas a lot of voluntary migrants, and this is also something that is often misunderstood about the immigration experience, there's a big percentage of migrants who are very much on the fence about staying, right? It's not that they say, well, I'm committing to America, right? They're like, well, I'm going to go try this out. And about 1/3 of immigrants actually return home. I don't know if you knew that, but about 1/3 of immigration flows are back home, right? And so there's a significant percentage that try it out, it doesn't work out, and they return. But forced migrants, they have no chance to return. So it's somewhat counterintuitive, but that's how it works, yeah.
So what kind of responsibility, I mean, especially for refugees or people seeking asylum, with the conditions in their own country,
Yeah.
is there any way that we can become more involved in a level of accountability that makes it easier for people to stay where they want to live and where they grew up and where their families are?
Oh, right. Yeah, so in case you didn't hear it, the question is, do we have any accountability to help make conditions better in the origin country so people aren't forced to leave? Is that the gist?
Yeah, and where the origin countries see that as a responsibility.
Oh, yeah, the origin, yeah. Yeah, so certainly, so that's right. Migration is not just about our country, it's a neighborhood issue, right? You have to think of it as a neighborhood problem if you want, right? And so you want to help others in the neighborhood, right? Or hold others in the neighborhood accountable so that doesn't happen, right? I think that's an approach that I'm trying to think of how controversial, but also how long-winded I want to get on this. So, yeah, no, it's a well-meaning question.
Like I have the answer.
So the U.S., let's talk about just the U.S., right? We could talk about Europe separately. The U.S. has been very Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde about this over time. When the US intervened in Central America to prevent communist regimes from popping up, right? The US, on paper, committed, right, to welcoming the refugees and asylum that would result from that process, and then didn't, right? There's a very good book on this called Everybody Who Is Gone Is Here. Very good book, and it explains that very well. By not doing that, these people that were literally at risk of being murdered entered the US illegally, right? So they were supposed to be humanitarian refugees, but we blocked that path, so we created our own crisis of illegal immigration in the 80s and 90s because we didn't play the neighborhood game very well. One of the things that the Trump administration has tried to do is to hold Mexico and Venezuela and El Salvador and Honduras accountable, but not in a way that's really helping them have the resources to do that, right? They have just sort of cajoled and said, well, you need to, right? But without acknowledging that many of the problems actually were created by our own foreign policy in a previous generation. So I agree with the question. We should hold those countries accountable, but we have to be honest about also that we ourselves have created some of the problem, right? By the way that we did our foreign policy. So. But yes, in principle, we have to manage this as it's a multilateral solution, right? And so I would say if the Trump administration does have one valid complaint, I don't agree with how they're going about it, but the point that the other countries have to do their part, I think is a fair point. It's just, we have to go about it in a way that makes sense. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, my name is Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you for this
Yeah.
discussion. I just had a question. I don't know if it makes a lot of distinction in terms of the job creation, the picture that you painted, but I'm just, imagine if you were an advisor to, I don't know about this president, but a president.
Speak a little louder.
Yeah, and you could advise on like a couple of different programs that they could choose.
Here.
Program, I'm sorry.
Just hold that.
Yeah, hi. But if you could be an advisor to a president, I was saying probably not this president, it may not matter, but and there were a couple of programs that you could advise, and you could kind of advise on one of them that they would have to pick. And I'm curious about the idea of someone who graduates with a graduate degree, like a STEM graduate degree, and you staple the NAT certificate to the degree, or versus another program where it's like a golden visa, where someone can essentially, buy a green card. And so I'm just curious if your picture changes, your thoughts on like either one of those or the other in terms of how this relates to the picture that you've created here. And then as a follow-up, I'm curious if you had any thoughts about, these golden visa programs, which are certainly nothing new. If anything, a lot of countries around the world are actually kind of rethinking their programs like that. So it's interesting that the president brought this up like it's, it's an old story that actually is, being rethought of around the world. But yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so the question is if I could advise a president, because there's a lot of proposals on different kinds of visa programs, like increasing the number of visas for skilled workers, right? So I think you've all heard let's staple a green card to every graduate diploma, right, that we give in the US, or the golden visa, which is you pay $5 million and you're essentially buying US citizenship, which is the latest proposal. So which one would I support? So let me answer this. Let's see if it works this way. I think part of what's behind the question is, do we want to support more skilled or unskilled immigrants, right? What kind of visa, what kind of policy priorities do we want to have, or do we want to support immigrants that come with capital, right? Like the EB-5 visa right now is the entrepreneurship visa, and if you have $1 million in investment capital, you have kind of a path towards citizenship. So I think that, so I understand the question, and I'm not accusing you of having the misperception, but there is a misperception out there that we have to choose between skilled and unskilled immigrants, right? And so I think the issue, but this is why it's part of the answer to what you're saying. I'm totally for, look, anyone who has a graduate degree from an American university, let's staple the visa to it because the benefits are like tangible and measurable, right? But the issue is that if we only have a policy that favors those kinds of immigrants, we're fooling ourselves. And here's why. Let's think of it, let's say you're Amazon, okay? Amazon needs these, engineers and all that to, write its algorithms so that we are tempted to spend more than we need to, right? But Amazon can't do what it does without unskilled workers who drive the trucks and staff the warehouses, right? But the same is true of any community. I mean, we certainly want really skilled people who patent, right? But we also need people who build our houses and those kinds of things. And so I think that the problem with many of the proposals is they're too imbalanced in favor of just one type of immigrant. So the short answer for me is all of the above. Now, the golden visa, I think that's just an assist to oligarchs, right? Which is kind of a weird thing. We have plenty of wealthy people in the U.S. I don't think that like of all policies that would be low on the priorities because the shortages we have are not in those with $5 million. It's everyone below that. So hopefully I gave you part of an answer. Yeah.
Follow up on that. That being said, is it possible to put in place some kind of a system with Trump's crazy proposal to bring executives to specify leave, to have those people bring all their unskilled workers under some kind of an umbrella system?
Yeah, sure.
All together.
That's fine. I'm for that. And I'm not against the golden. You want to have a golden visa type program, as long as the process is fair, right? As long as it's not just the president's best rich friend, that's fine. But as long as, I'm for that. But we need all of the above solutions, right? So I'll give you another example. I get this question a lot where people say, well, look at Canada, right? Canada seems to have a great immigration system. In Canada, the way you get in is, I don't know if this analogy is going to hit the mark, but my kids like video games, right? And in video games, you pick your player based on attributes, right? Strength, speed, right? And so Canada has a little bit of a video game player type system where you get points. You get points for language ability, you get points for degrees, and if you hit a certain number of points, you're in, right? You have a path to citizenship in Canada. But that's determined by the government, right? And so some people say, well, isn't that the way we should do it? Because then we're vetting and making sure that people have basic skills and basic ability to integrate. The problem with a system like that is that the government has never been a very good central planner, right? And so it is kind of Soviet-style central planning for people. And so what you get with the Canadian system is you get like the proverbial Iranian engineer driving a taxi because they met the points, but no employer wanted that person, right? So one of the nice things about the U.S. employment system is that it's tied to a job offer from a company. So anyone who comes has a job and isn't just driving a taxi or driving Uber. The problem is we just don't have enough of them, right? So here's another one of these like parlor trick numbers that you can throw out there. So we give 1 million green cards in the US per year. I don't know if you knew that, 1 million green cards since 1990, right? How many of those are employment-based? Does anybody know? Out of 1 million? Yeah, 140,000, right? Which Pennsylvania could use on its own every year, right? So it's too low. So we need 500,000 of those at least a year. Yes.
Oh, I just had a question about the 5% to 15% coaster you put up.
Yeah.
Sort of in the definition of immigrant, is the 5 to 15% like folks verified in the census that have status, or is that an estimate of kind of all immigrant population? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. That is all immigrants, including undocumented or illegal or whatever term you prefer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Should all the illegal immigrants be deported?
I'm surprised it took this long for that question to come up. Should all the illegal immigrants be deported? So, again, let me state, I don't think illegal immigration is the right way to go, okay? We have, at the latest estimate as of about 2 or 3 weeks ago, is that we have 13.7 million illegal or undocumented immigrants in this country. That's a quarter of all immigrants, by the way, right? So, should they all be deported? Let me give you a cold economic answer, okay? And then we can talk about humanitarian and other issues. From an economic standpoint, the economy doesn't care, right? These 13.7 million people are doing all of these things, okay? So the question is, do you want less of this? Because that's what you're going to get when you kick 13.7 million people out. Okay, you're kicking out 13.7 million taxpayers, consumers, people who are filling crucial jobs. And by the way, let me now explain. We actually know what would happen, so we don't have to speculate about what would happen because we've done it before. Okay, and we have good empirical evidence on what happens. So I'll give you a few examples from history. The most recent one happened under the Obama administration. So I don't know if you knew that Obama actually deported more people than Trump did in his first term. The main program through which this was done was Secure Communities, the Secure Communities program, okay? And you can see by the name, right? This is supposed to protect you, right? It's supposed to protect you. Well, a study showed that for every 100 people deported through Secure Communities, about 8 Americans lost jobs. Okay? Why? Because you're kicking out people that do these things, you're shrinking the economy, and a smaller economy needs fewer jobs, right? So we know that. We also know that a similar thing happened during the Great Depression when US politicians thought that to help American workers, we should deport all Mexican Americans because that would somehow be helpful. So, and it was a successful program in the sense that the US government managed to deport half of the Mexican American population at the time, 400,000 people. Again, Americans lost jobs. Those that could get them got worse jobs. Why worse jobs? Because you have a less vibrant economy, right? The other thing that we know from the 1924 restrictions on immigration is that US-born scientists became less innovative, right? They became 70% less likely to patent permanently. Anyway, and think of the tax base, right? The tax base that gets eroded. So should we do it? From an economic standpoint, that would be a disaster, right? From a humanitarian standpoint, it would be also because what you have to do to identify, round up, and ship off 13.7 million people is, let's just say it would be draconian, right? That would be the kindest word one could use. So again, we want to fix the system so we don't have so much illegal immigration. Speaking as a scholar, okay, speaking as an academic, I would say that we are better off finding a path toward legalization for these 13.7 million people than trying to kick them out. Because just the cost, we're not even talking about the cost of losing these 5 things, literally just the cost of identifying, housing, and shipping off 13.7 million people would be more costly than providing a path to citizenship for them. Anyway. Yeah.
What is the most cogent argument against the points that you're making us today? I mean, you're being very persuasive with the economics and the graph and everything, but when confronted with your arguments and your evidence, what's the most cogent response? Not the visceral response, the most cogent one.
Thank you for asking that. That's very good, right? It's always good to the most cogent response. So I think there's two responses for which what I've said don't really have an answer, right? Which is, one is someone could say, well, look, these people broke the law, right? We're a country of laws. We have to enforce the law, right? And to that, I can't say, no, they didn't, because they did. In fact, they did, right? And they committed I can't remember what kind of felony it is. It's a class something felony, right? And so if you give me a legalistic argument, absolutely, right? Now, you could still talk about, like, is the law just or unjust or all that, but that's one. The other argument that is very hard to prove, now it's easy to prove that historically it's wrong, but it's hard to prove that in the future it will be wrong, is that someone can always say, okay, fine, Italians in the early 1900s turned out fine, right? Irish in the 1840s, they turned out fine. Jewish and Poles and Eastern Europeans in the 1910s, they turned out fine. But this next group, they're the problem. Muslims, right? They're the problem. So that is very hard to prove. I can't prove that the next group won't be a problem. I can historically prove that no group has ever been a problem, even as different as they seem to be. Those are the two arguments to which I don't have empirical answers, right? It comes down to values, it comes down to other answers. But honestly, empirically, there aren't many good arguments. There just aren't, right? Because we could have the argument about, do immigrants create jobs or take jobs? And the evidence is so overwhelmingly on the job creation side that you can believe whatever you want, right? So it's the unprovable arguments that are the most cogent, right? Which is why this is so pernicious, because you can't prove it. I think you had a question first.
One's historical, because I don't know the answer to it, and that's, when was it that the executive got the power to just turn off all refugees?
When did the executive get the power to turn off refugees? So that has been developing over time. It really wasn't an issue until the Cold War, right? So the reason that we undid the 1924 law is it very much had to do with foreign policy, right? We were fighting the Cold War against Russia, the Soviet Union, against the Soviet Union, and we were saying, well, you are a repressive regime, right? And you had all these people fleeing this repressive regime from countries that we had deemed were inferior in the 1920s, and we didn't have a system to accept them, and so it was during those Cold War years that Truman and other presidents started to kind of develop the precedent of the president having the authority to sort of let in asylees and refugees. So it sort of developed in those years, but the problem is it never became quite formalized. It's sort of been a hodgepodge of precedent and foreign policy priority, so, and that can be abused when you don't have a clear system. Anyway, yeah. So that's how it developed, yeah. And you had another question.
The other question sort of follows on this cogent thing, and that's that since what you're saying seems really pretty obvious in terms of the benefits to both immigrants and the society, why is this not being, I read somewhere that, it takes 132 countries to even build an iPhone. All the components are being, made in many different places. So we're an interdependent world in all sorts of ways economically.
Yeah. So
since this is, to me, what you've presented makes total sense.
Yeah.
Why is this not the discussion, the conversation, and why are there not people saying, yes, we need, again, as it was a while ago, we need paths to citizenship.
Because I'm not president, I guess? No.
No,
I'm joking. I'm joking. I'm just teasing you.
You're not alone.
Yeah, there are. That's a very interesting question, and there's some. We have some answers, but not all of them, right? So first, I want to say that I'm not the only one saying, right? This is not just my research, by the way, right? This is decades of research by many people, including me. But I'm a sliver of this. So the academic consensus is reasonably clear, right? There are areas in which we fight, of course, but reasonably clear overall. So one of it is there's always been a very strong political incentive to blame the outsider for whatever problem exists. And so what you're hearing today is not new, right? I would encourage you, go back to the history of the Irish in the US, right? And go look at what the Know Nothing Party platform was, and you replace After this? Okay. You replace Irish for Mexican or Asian, and it's the same. The other reason is that it seems the illusion that most people are against immigrants is an illusion. Actually, 2/3 of Americans are in favor of immigration, but we have this federal level political fight that is divorced from reality. So if you go down to the grassroots level, so groups like this, I speak to chambers of commerce, small and medium businesses, there's a lot of bipartisan support for immigration. But it's just that at the federal level, we have this thing that's totally disconnected. So I would say also it's a little bit of an illusion, right? The problem is that you have a minority that's very well-funded and powerful that is sort of taken over right now politically. That's not always been the case, so the pendulum can swing. So maybe because time is short and I need to shut up, I would end by saying, don't be fooled into that it's just a few people. The majority is on this side. It's just the majority doesn't have the power at the moment, but they will. All right, I need to finish.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.